So we were speaking about the ancient cattle cultures of ancient Gebts, or the Gebts, the Gebts, the Gebts, the Gebts, the Kemet, ancient Egypt. And here in this part 3 of Pyramid Code, we have Robert Bouval, Egyptologist, who has brought some very interesting facts. Orion Mystery, I think, is one of his books. Now here is speaking about how in pre-dynastic Egypt, you understand, we have to understand there's a pre-dynastic, before the dynasties were established in ancient Egypt, that these cultures were focused on the cattle and the symbolic. The cattle played an important role, not just as symbology, not just as some so-called religion, but in the whole culture. And it was a very holistic way of life. Now, what we was making mention of in the previous portion was that when we look into the Ethiopic manuscripts, like Kufale, the Methafe Kufale and the Methafe Hanok, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch, or Hanok, it is very interesting what we find there. And when we look into the oldest manuscripts, we find that the symbology now, in reference and vis-a-vis, even to an extent within the Gedla Adam, and the Gedla Adam, which is another ancient work, which is preserved only in the Ethiopic. Now remember, ancient Egypt was a colony of ancient Ethiopia, ancient Tobia. But now what has gone on in many, many countries, many, many places, is people have moved around, people have shifted. You understand? Even people have been assimilated, and so we're not seeing the ancient people. When we look at this archaeology, we're not seeing the modern people who reflect the ancient people, and this is especially true in modern Egypt. And as I was mentioning before, it's important to understand the history, you understand, of how Kemet, from ancient Kemet to the present time, the ancient Kemet to the present time. So we need to work with a basic chronology, but we also need to recognize that there is the modern Eurocentric Egyptologist chronology. Now, those who are featured in this particular series right here, Pyramid Code, they all dispute the so-called modern chronology and the modern interpretation of ancient Egypt. They don't come out rightly and say that it was black or African or Afro-Shemitic, but they do point in that particular direction and point out a lot of the major errors using some of the major evidence. So let's look at what the fall of Egypt. You see, Egypt fell. You know what I'm saying? Egypt fell, and and the fall was brought about by different factors, and many of our Afrocentric Egyptologists, they present certain evidence, like the abuse of African hospitality, genocidal conspiracy, which we know today as global white supremacy. In the Bible, you understand, the true Bible of the Ayus, or the black Jews, when we interpret it properly, we call that the reign of the Gentiles, the rise of the Gentiles. Today we call it modern global white supremacy, which began in the form of Asiatic and Indo-European ancient forms of imperialism that contributed greatly to the fall of ancient Kemet. Then the second point that's often pointed out is the disobedience of the universal laws of the Most High, of El Elyon, of Lu'ul, by certain African kings and priests who misuse their power for selfish or lower chakra, lower consciousness gains, thereby alienating the true instruments of government from the people. Now, it's important to understand this, especially where we're at today and what we're facing in our different movements and operations, and even within the Ethiopian World Federation, just to put that out there. that there were certain African kings, black kings and priests, who misused their power or their authority for selfish gains. And when they did this, they alienated from themselves the spiritual, metaphysical instruments of government from the people. And thirdly, there's the culture of denial, or the cult, really, of denial, of ignorance, of hypocrisy that was perpetrated by these corrupt powers, or these corrupt individuals that were corrupt by the powers and principalities that Brother Paul talks about in Ephesians, which continues to this day to damage the true Ethiopian self-esteem, the African self-esteem, and even for Ethiopian, for us, our national identity. But then we would look at a chronological list of who were the invaders and the conquerors. It's very important to know the different periods, the Hyksos or the Hekshau period. Some say 2500 to 2333 BC, or what's the 15th to the 17th dynasty. Then we see the Assyrians come in 725 BC, which was roughly the 26th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Then we see the Persians come in 525 BC, the 28th dynasty. Then we see the Greeks and the Macedonians, 332 BC, which was the 31st dynasty. Then the Romans come in, which is 30 BC to 31, the 31st dynasty. Then we have the Arabs, or the Arabs, and this is a mixed multitude, because the original Arabs were the black Arabs, like in Sudan and Somalia and those places and areas and regions. And then we had the white Arabs, the pale, the red Arabs as well. But the Arab invasion was 640 AD, which resulted in what we basically is the roots of what we're looking at in modern Egypt. So these people there today, and Hawass, that guy Hawass that you've seen on so many Egyptian programs, whatever, keeper of antiquity, so forth and so on, has allowed exactly what this brother Bouval is saying right here. Let's rewind this once again. So when he's talking about what's going on right here with these precious antiquities
and population, there are ancient cave paintings in a remote location that may provide clues to human settlements from the distant past. Is this crucial evidence being protected by Egyptian authorities?
That is priceless historic evidence. Look here. Once this is down, it goes down a mountain. See the mountain? He's getting pharaonic clothes. Terrible. Scribbled all over it. And the evidence that we're looking for is being destroyed by responsible people coming here.
Well, actually, squatters. Speaking about the squatters, same squatters we're trying to tell you about. The so-called the Arabs now was in the list. We could say the sixth of these invaders, conquerors, interlopers, squatters, beggars, who basically came in and occupied, enslaved the native remaining population, like the black brother right there that's with him. Now, Egypt is known as a white country, which is interesting because many of the descendants of the Nubians and the indigenous people, like his native guide right there, these were the ones who were enslaved. These were the ones who were suppressed. And then we also get to see the spread of so-called Islam or Mohammedanism. Now, in order to understand what's happening today, you need to get a good understanding at least of what happened yesterday. And then we get to the transatlantic, the slave trade, several centuries later, but in 1501 AD. But then even after that, we have the Turks, the Ottoman Turks come in 1798 AD. Then we have the French coming in. in 1798 to 1802 AD. You have the British coming in 1802 to roughly 03 AD. Then the Turks. There was a back and forth war among these different superpowers or white supremacy of that time. And then the British again, they gained the upper hand from 1882 to 1952 AD. And then we have the Berlin Conference, which we know from right here, just to show you this right here, the Berlin Conference, right? The Berlin Conference, which divided Africa, the Berlin Conference. So it's a historical map of Africa from 1688 AD, illustrating the continent before the Berlin Conference in 1885 in Berlin, Germany. Right, this is how Africa looked, and even Africa we know also by the name of Ethiopia, the continent of Ethiopia, because the ocean over here, where they say the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, where the slaves were, or where the Africans, the lost sheep, were enslaved and taken to the west. This was known as the Ethiopic Ocean. Now, if Ethiopia is over here, right here, right, today, then how could this be the Ethiopic Ocean over here? You would think maybe this would be the Ethiopic Ocean here, but why would this be the Ethiopic Ocean over here? So all these are clues. You understand? Now, after this, basically, what happened was what we see right here with the modern nation states in Africa. As you study that, the only one that was not colonized was Ethiopia, was Judeo-Christian, Davidic, Solomonic Ethiopia. All right? So this basically is kind of the history of this, a summary of it, from a very good book by a brethren of I, this brother right here, Nabenge. He wrote this book called African Unity, the Only Solution. You see the African Passport, promoting the ideas of Haile Selassie and Dr. Malaku Amanu Obeyin, the United States of Africa. So you might have heard about the United States of Africa, but you probably don't know who is the true originator, you understand, of that idea and how that's connected to Rastafari, Haile Selassie I, Dr. Malaku Amanu Obeyin, and thus the Ethiopian World Federation in spirit and in truth. So this is just a kind of a sample right there. But let's go on with this so we can get to the point that we wanted to bring to you before we're about to go into the next sabbatical portion, 40. And there's a couple of the areas we didn't really fully touch on in this week's worth of shiurim or lectures and classes and teaching. So let's go a little bit more forward, and we just want to give you that background because he hesitates, Boval hesitates here. He puts it very, very politely. You know, who's responsible for the destruction of this evidence? You know what I'm saying? You can see clearly that the evidence of the ancient has been scribbled over by the so-called squatter Arabs, the Bedouins and others who are squatting. They have scribbled over this, and that the so-called Department of Antiquities has not done its so-called job, responsibility in protecting this, but is allowing it to be destroyed, and for good reason, because then they can deny the African presence, you understand, in ancient dynastic or dynastic Egypt. So let's play it.
Responsible people coming here, the site is unprotected. And the irony is that people who are responsible are ultimately coming here and living crazy with licenses and papers.
It almost sounds like the Federation, driven crazy with license and, you know what I'm saying? Anyway.
It's a beautiful, a very town. Look at this, this is license, this is a primitive project.
Okay, now check this out.
Pre-dynastic Egyptian belief systems originated with cattle cults linked to the Nile. The cow was seen as the mother of the sun. Cattle were deified and were considered earthly representatives of the gods. an enduring ideology with Hathor as the center figure.
Okay, pause right there. Now, Hathor. Now, remember the connection that we've been seeking to reveal with Miriam. Miriam, the sister of Mashu or Moshe Muse, the head of the fraternal order of the Lewawian, the Levites, and his brother Aaron. So the cattle, or the cow, the cattle, both the bulls, for example, in Kufali or Jubilees, in the older manuscripts, it speaks of Adam and the males being like bulls, the patriarchs being like bulls, and the female matriarchs being likened to heifers, you know what I'm saying, or to female cows in the same way, in the very same way. And this is from the so-called, the true Judaic, you understand, the Ethiopic tradition and the ancient books that were in a sense, Genesis, in the chronology of events or in the orders such as the book of Enoch as well. We find this symbology, this very interesting symbology. Now in the later writings, even through the Ethiopic tradition, when it began to be interpreted, we find less of Adam being referred to as like a red, I think even a red bull, I think it was a red bull, and there's the red heifer, or the white cow, and this symbology is used, but then it's interpreted later on, and that symbology now becomes, in a sense, upgraded, or we don't find that symbology in the latter, like when we look into the Amharic, you understand, the Amharic translation of the ancient Ethiopic and some of the latter Ethiopic scrolls, but the oldest of them, and we haven't published it as of yet, but we are seeking to publish those works soon so you can really study it and see it for yourself. The one that we have available is the Gedla Adam, or the combat, the conflict of Adam and Eve against Satan. Now all this is very much connected with ancient Egypt. So we're understanding that in Egypt, according to this vid and the evidence, that the cattle was highly regarded. Now within the pre-Genesis, in a sense, books of the Bible, like Metzafe Henok, Metzafe Kufale, the Gedla Adam as well, we find that same sort of symbology being used. Now, the people had come out of Egypt, right? The people had come out of Egypt, but yet much of Egypt, that culture, that socialization was in them. So how interesting, in the 39th Torah portion, chapter 19, we read of the Para Aduma, or the red heifer. And the heifer is the female cow that has not born a calf. So we have to understand that distinction, because they were worshiping the golden calf. You understand? Previously in the book of Exodus, the sin of the golden calf, which is the baby, you understand, or the so-called man-child, some would say, that man-child, ancient man-child symbology, that to the ancients who use this symbolic logic to describe it, it's the same way we do, but we use it with words. What we see here is an imagery that basically describes it in very, not just natural terms, but in terms that were easy to understand and was holistic to their environment. Now, what we have in the Bible is that upgrading to extent, a preservation of the core information, but an upgrading of it. It's like instead of referring to, say, Cain and Abel as two types of bulls, right? And we have this in the Ethiopic writings, but not their names. Later on, we can now identify them. Now, when it becomes identified, you understand, in other words, when it's interpreted, it's like when Christ in chapter 13 of Matthäus Wengel, when Christ is describing the sower. A sower went forth to sow. We can see that within ancient Egypt, the symbology of the sower. And the sower usually goes forth to sow, and usually the cattle is connected with that, if you understand the agriculture. Not just culture, but agriculture. Now, instead, the so-called modern Egyptologists and others who follow or fool them, you know what I'm saying, they talk about it's a cult. It's a cult. You know what I'm saying? Then others talk about the occult. But yet most don't know, well, what does culture truly mean? So we wanted to point this out right here as a connective evidence, because in the next chapter, chapter 20, in this Torah portion, this parasha, we have the death of Miriam, the death of Mary, right? So Mary was regarded, or Miriam rather, was regarded amongst the Israelites and many of the Israelites in the mixed multitude as, in a sense, a type, you know what I'm saying, as a type of or set, one could say ISIS, but more correctly, according to what the Bible discloses to us, a type of Hathor. Because interesting that after the red heifer, the ritual of the red heifer and the waters of separation, that in the next chapter Miriam dies, she's buried, and then there's no water. There's no water. Now there's the earlier theme concerning water in the previous Torah portion. We'll connect that hopefully with the feet as we go forward. But just when you look at the sequence, chapter 19 is almost fully devoted to this ritual, and we have to ask in the context of the time, what was this ritual all about? And how interesting that this ritual has symbolic elements that are directly connected with ancient Egypt. And when we interpret the inner gnosis of the story, we can see that Miriam was a type of Echit or Hathor, and that Aaron was a type of Horus or Cheru, since he was the high priest in that sense. And then we have Moses, on a certain level, also being an Osar type that becometh a Horus type, that according to Exodus and according to the word of YAHWEH, the God of the Hebrews, says that Moses is as a God. He's as a Netaru to Pharaoh. So he's as an Elohim to Pharaoh. So from Pharaoh's perspective, Moses became as a Neter. You know what I'm saying? In other words, a God. And now when we look at the study of ancient Egypt, we can make that connection very much more easily. So this is a part of what we wanted to add as a supplement, or part of the overflow on this particular Rastafari Sabbatical study, or RSS number 39, known as Hukat, or Yehigu Te'izaz.
The edges of bulls were shown with depictions of stars, but this dates to before pre-dynastic Egypt. Cattle pastoralists were in the Sahara several thousand years before pre-dynastic Egypt. Kabir, which means large plateau, is another large ceremonial center a further 600 kilometers west, near the borders of Libya, the Sudan, and Egypt. The Cave of the Swimmers, made famous by the movie The English Patient, is located here. Prehistoric rock art shows people and their cattle. Since Hills Kabir is 600 kilometers away, it seems as though cattle cults were prevalent throughout North Africa in ancient times. Could this be another clue that the nomadic tribes were connected? Could they have influenced the ancient Egyptians?
Now, that's a major point there that I think Karen Bolter, professor, Canadian professor, that's an important point that she makes right there. like I said, although they do not speak about the humanity or the ethnicity of these pre-dynastic or dynastic cattle culture people, we clearly know that they were black people. We know that this is Afro-Shemitic, that this is African as well. Now, another interesting point is that Moses, when he flees after the murder of the Egyptian, he goes to Midian, which was like a state within the ancient Ethiopian empire of the ancient times. He goes to a particular place called Midian, and he learns from a high priest named Jethro. Now, it's because that Jethro, according to the Bible, he doesn't appear to be a Hebrew at first, but then when you look into the chronology of Abraham and the genealogy, you find that after Sarah died, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, that Abraham had a third wife, Keturah, and he had 6 sons. One was Midian, and the other was Sheba, Saba, or Sheba. So we find that both Jethro and Sipara and Zipporah, they also are Hebrew. So it's interesting that the first identification of the true God, or the God of Moses, we can almost say that the God that Moses reintroduced from the headwaters of the Nile, from ancient Tobia and Ethiopia, is is Yahweh, because he says that I am the God of the Hebrews. So there was a confusion of who truly is God. This is why Moses said that, well, the people are going to ask, well, what is his name? What is his name? Because the name was the key identified. Not like people today, where somebody would say, well, we all believe in one God, or there's all one God, and nobody asks what's his name. You know, that's a little trick that they do right there. You know, so they never mention the name. You understand? Or they rarely mention the name. They talk about state and church and state and all these other sort of things right there. But Moses, being learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, as Acts chapter 7 verse 22 says, and he was mighty in word and deed. So this video here is showing that there were ancient pre-dynastic cattle cultures where the key symbology, the origins, we find the origins, as Gerald Macy says in his work. If we look for the origins, we shouldn't go to Asia. You understand? Or we shouldn't go to so-called East or like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq and over there to find, or Babylon to find the answers. But we need to go to the south. We need to go to the headwaters from where the living waters flowed, and that's ancient Tobia or ancient Ethiopia, and that's inner Africa. All right?
Arriving at the monastery, we can see that it has never been accessible by road. Once occupied by Christians, it lies upon an ancient camel trail, 40 days from its closest neighboring site.
Now this is interesting too, because this almost reminds I of Ethiopia in the sense of, you know, the construction and the fact that there was a community here that was Christian. And we see the same process as we see in the Exodus out of ancient Egypt. That there were the Israelites, there were those who were of the family, the 70 souls that the Bible says there's 70 souls, but yet there was this population, there was this mixed multitude, there was other peoples, you understand, almost like the kind of Jew and Gentile idea of the New Testament. There were other peoples that also came out with them. For what reason? Not so much because of the racial reasons, not because they were part of the same family, so to speak, but it was because of the spirituality, the ability to receive the inner gnosis, the inner gnosis. You know, and this is what united them, this is what brought them together. Now here they're speaking about, the only part I didn't like the fact that they didn't go into much more detail and focus on some of the art, but you can see a lot of the art has been erased or kind of like sand washed, not whitewash so much, that would be too obvious, but where they take sand and they rub down, the faces. It always seems like the faces somehow wear out. You ever notice that? You can see the arms and the legs are black, but the faces somehow seem to wear out, even though that thing is hanging way up there. You'd be like, how did that happen? And why only the faces? Why not the other faces that you may see there, or the other things you may see? But why always the faces? And the Egyptologists try to lie to us, and they're lying, on behalf of white supremacy, or the liars, the evildoers. But it's interesting right here, because it was an ancient Christian community that was settled in this same region. Now, it's interesting because oftentimes certain ancient sites would be sacred to certain believers or mitmenon, or those who have faith a certain way. And now when the faith was upgraded in the time of the Hebrews or the Hebrews, there was a mixed multitude, and many even Egyptians that came out with the Beit Israel. You understand? Because in Egypt they were persecuted religiously speaking. They were in bondage. They could not freely express their religious Hebraic orientation. So the elements we find in Egypt and these elements, cryptic elements in the Bible, are connected. You see, the key thing is getting past the so-called whitewash and the white supremacy, not just the image, as we mentioned in some of the other lectures. People take down the white so-called Jesus, but haven't taken down the white supremacist misinterpretation, the other gospel. So they take on the white Jesus picture, but they still are going in the so-called white Jesus or the other Jesus mentality.
There still shows evidence of having been an oasis, with a huge acacia tree that is more than 800 years old. The team has a picnic on a carpet of yellow acacia flowers.
It's a wonderful oasis. We are very pleased with test of the cars, everything's working fine, the drivers are fine, and it was a good idea to come and rest here. I needed the rest because after all this tents waiting for the permit, everything is ready, the permits are ready.
Yeah, but you must be so living now, this place, stay with the hotel, and stay overnight, and doing stuff tomorrow up early at 3 a.m. in the morning.
I'm ready.
Yes, I know you're ready, but you don't know, it's a hard way. Hard way to arrive at December.
That's true. We waited a long time, let's do it. Let's have a good night.